You're using African states experience thinking that because in some cases because I'm black, that it will make the same sense. When the truth, in fact, my race is not a problem. It's the number of people that live on my island that's a problem. It's the amount of voices. So I do take the point where do not behave like an individual to whatever, but when you're matching 2.9 million people on an island versus almost 5 billion people in China, or 29 million people in a city in Africa, it really doesn't, my voice, my 2.9 million voice that I represent does not matter.
Yeah, so I think that kind of represents one of the biggest challenges to addressing climate change. How can you get equity in terms of voice? How can less developed nations who are impacted first and who have the greatest sense of urgency, how can they be brought in this process and their voice be given priority? And there's no simple answer to that, for sure.
There goes water, as you had indicated, that James Hansen said in 50 years. And in my opinion, 50 years is going to go really fast.
Yeah.
And if you're going to rely on all of us to, reduce our carbon footprint, I mean, all that's great. But what Jamaica needs and all of the, even the eastern coast of the United States, all the, every one that's located on the water, needs a disaster preparedness and resilience plan. That's what you need to be working on in conjunction with helping to bring down the carbon
but just to add a little bit of element
priority.
But just to add a little bit of element to it, just to be quick, we do have a disaster plan, but is 1.1 still with 1.5 degrees Celsius. Will that disaster plan make any sense when 30% of my island is gone underwater? It won't.
And I think the point you're making is that we need to really, that mitigation really is important. A lot of energy is switches to adaptation, which we're going to have to do anyway. But that's why the divestment campaign and attacking the politics behind it is really important. And the mitigation, we still can play an important role in.
I have 3 questions and I'll be really quick. Is natural gas a part of fossil fuel?
Yeah, most certainly, yeah.
Right. Fossil fuel divestment in an era of TPP. Can you talk to that?
In an era of
TPP, the Trans-Pacific
Okay.
Partnership.
Yeah. So and Naomi Klein alluded to this, that the problems with the TTP is that it inhibits any form of innovation that can take place within alternative energy markets. That it stops protectionism, which is actually needed, I think, in my opinion, for alternative energy. And the TTP actually inhibits any form of innovation and progressive green energy plans. So that most certainly, if we are addressing, again, that brings us back to the politics, why it is so important that we can have this fantastic new fuel cell technology or new efficiencies in green energy. But maybe these macro trade agreements are going to inhibit or block it. So that's why, and that's a very important point.
It's about targeting fossil fuel divestment and the Trans-Pacific Partnership at the same time.
Yeah, so that's, and something we get onto at the very end, that divestment is one small tactic within a broader climate justice movement. It's just one arm of it. Yeah.
Last question. How can we find out about our university, if our university is an investor or not? Are you going to guide us through that?
I'll go on to that afterwards. Yeah.
Accolades. I think we had up there, one of the arguments against divestment was that we have technology that can make using it clean. And you sort of, either you went so fast over that one, I didn't hear it, or you skipped it. I don't know what. I was wanting to get a lot.
Was it the carbon capture comment?
Probably. I mean, yeah.
Oh yeah. So there is an argument that carbon capture technologies is going to save the day. That this new technology is going to be invented, or some billionaire philanthropist is going to donate X amount of money, is going to save us all. And that really is wishful thinking. that technologies aren't proven yet. We might actually need it. I think a study just came out yesterday that said that we will actually need negative carbon emissions as well if we are to stay under 2 degrees. So we're even going to need it to keep under 2 degrees, but at the moment that technology isn't there. So that's the point I was making.
And there's analysis too of like the one plant in the U.S. is supposed to have like the foremost carbon capture, like the only one that actually has it implemented. I don't know if it is in like Texas. And it actually, when they did the entire life cycle analysis of the carbon for that plant, it was, yeah. Wait, is it in Texas?
I don't know, but
It was much higher than projected, if not worse than some traditional plants, just scrubber technology, like technology that brings pollutants out.
Yeah.
I don't want to interrupt the order of things, so this may not be in order, but I hope we just get to this discussion of the problematic of, Naomi Klein talks about this, of being defensive, anti, and kind of single issue. And I just want to open up the possibility that between fracking and the divestment movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Occupy movement, that to really kind of talking about these individual issues without talking about capitalism and like who owns and controls, and really radically challenging the fundamental premise that these corporations should even exist. That what they have no right to exist. They've been violating the principles of Commonwealth, raping the earth all this time. And why are we even making, Hampshire divested. I'm teaching UMass in the Department of Communication. I was part of the anti-apartheid movement at Hampshire and beyond. Hampshire has divested, and I was asking at the 5-college divestment group, well, what's Hampshire doing now? And he said, nothing.
Yeah.
Right? So there's this very, this is a tactic in a larger strategy, and I think, again, we just had the rappelling going on, the incredible acts. We have all these kind of, almost like the civil rights movement in this very informal way of the lunch counter sit-ins. Wherever there's fracking, there's all these actions of civil disobedience, grassroots all over the country, and there's not a united. And so I just think we need to talk about how do we create a kind of unified counter-narrative demands and not limit ourselves. The young people I teach are facing a tremendous economic debt situation. And these are all connected issues. And so here at the center, we're supposed to be radical political economists or coming out of that tradition. And I just want to, I hope that kind of conversation can happen somewhere here.
We can have that now, actually, because it probably makes logical sense that we switch the conversation now to how we can connect all these broader and disparate movements, such as Black Lives Matter, the 15 or minimum wage, or there is the criticism that divestment, that it can be too narrow or focused, or what happens when a school divests, it shouldn't just end there. Maybe Jessica will take some notes and yeah.
I can't come at this from a different angle, and I was much involved in divestment work very early on because I've written a book about local people trying to stop illegal mining in their community, and I found myself talking to college students or being invited to college campuses, including Unity in New Hampshire, because they were working on divestment and wanted to connect with people that were directly affected by fossil fuel mining or use or whatever. I don't know whether folks at Unity or Hampshire have followed up on those connections. I do know that Swarthmore, which the divestment movement there became sort of a clearinghouse for people working on divestment all over the country, in large part because students at Swarthmore had an ongoing connection with people who were directly affected by mountaintop removal, and that was a lot of their personal motivation for sticking with it and for networking more widely. And let me just wrap up why I think this matters. Connecting with, if you're doing a divestment campaign, connecting with some community that's directly affected by it, either a local community where there's a coal power plant, or the communities affected by mining or whatever, finding some way to make that connection makes the issue more personal for you, and that personal quality gives you, I think it's important both for giving you the motivation to stick with it, and also keeping you focused on doing it right. Because really why you're doing this is not some abstract, where somebody's money goes. It's about that it affects real people's lives. And the other reason to make that connection with directly impacted communities is that people who live there have a much stronger stake in this than the rest of us. They're strongly motivated to fix the problem because in many cases it's literally killing people that they know. They have very compelling stories, and together that makes them very powerful allies. So it's not just a matter of feeling warm and fuzzy because you're doing something good for people. The people that are affected by this are going to be your best and most persistent allies in this fight. And making those connections outside of your campus also goes directly to building a wider movement, because you're going to be inevitably dealing with people that have very different lives from you and different concerns, and integrating that into a broader movement for a more just and sustainable economy and society that's one way that it can start happening.
Yeah. Those are some fantastic recommendations, and Jessica's going to take on some of the notes. So maybe from here on in, we can have a conversation of how to broaden the divestment movement, or how to link other climate justice or social justice movements together.
I was going to talk about this in the next session, intersectionality, but I was talking to a woman who came back from the UN Women's Conference one year, and she said what they were all saying there, because everybody had all these problems all over the board, and said what they need is a unifying rallying cry. One thing that everybody could get under, get behind, instead of, Black Lives Matter and divest and all these different separate things. And that's what the intersectionality is all about, is how to bring all these together. And there's a reason why it took 76 years for the women's movement to get the voting rights, because they were all over the place. They were anti-slavery, they were for temperance, they were for property rights, they were for this, for that. And when they finally all gathered together under one banner of and made a decision to go with votes for women, women got the right to vote in the state. So I'm all for finding a unifying rallying cry. As an aside, I've spent the last 15 years writing a novel that has a rallying cry in it.
Yeah, and that's a challenge to find one particular rally cry. So, yeah.
I do agree that I think that the rallying cry is a critique and an understanding of capitalism, and I question to what degree even people who are change oriented actually understand what capitalism actually is, especially because some of the movements that we're seeing today are being advanced by young people who have never seen anything different. And it's hard to understand what capitalism is if you don't understand how it came about, where there were alternative, even in history, where there were alternative points to see something different. I don't know how to create that sort of awareness, but I think that there's, we're a long ways away from the Cold War, and I think that this might be a time to bring up the issue of what is capitalism? Is it what we want? Maybe an advancement by young people to look at critiques of capitalism through the lens of Marxism, and to bring Marxism back into the conversation of intelligentsia again.
Without being fired.
Without being fired.
We go deep, so, okay.
Oh, I was just, maybe to get back to your point on what's happening in terms of like student movement, there's, and kind of broader widening climate movement organizing. Right now there's developing for like flood the system actions that are happening in September.
Say that again.
Flood Flood the System, putting on by like Rising Tide Network, and that's trying to, you know, climate justice, this idea of climate justice is based in an anti-capitalist lens, like, and that whole, so the idea is that you're nationally doing these small actions regionally that are based in grassroots work, and people, you know, having specific targets and working in the area that they know how. That can be like women's groups doing stuff. It could be people doing actions against coal-fired power plants. It can be you know, different groups around, and then it's also coupled with this like large-scale convergence actions, and so seeing things like people's climate march, but in a or it was a March on Wall Street or something.
I think flood on Wall Street.
Yeah. That kind of scale and level of radicalism, large scale.
Yeah.
And so just that's something that's coming up recently and is currently being organized, and it might be something to.
If I can briefly add to that really quickly, it's basically a nationally organized movement with locally centered relevant protests, which are relevant locally. So it's not like what's happening at the national level. Sometimes what happens at the national level does not make sense on the local level. But what Flood the System is trying to do is take these local movements and try and integrate them nationally through a well-coordinated national organization. And what they do is they have, I think, monthly or weekly calls where everybody who's in touch with these organizers get in touch, and they speak with, have a general call basically to tell them what's happening, where we are moving. And the date that's set for, on at least on their Facebook page, is September the 1st.
And what are can somebody just tell me what are there concrete demands that
Yeah,
are being
it's like
issued
on
to
the
the state, to the
website.
corporate, what is it?
Maybe you could on the website.
But you have organizations already like Moral Monday. Reverend Barber had 80,000 people following him. And if we all think about it, we're saying that the actions are immoral, that, you know, they're unacceptable behavior. And my only challenge with doing this is it's like reinventing the wheel, and there's all these different models out there. He had 80,000 people follow him in North Carolina. So, under the Moral Monday lens. So, you can have a Moral Monday in Massachusetts and all
Oh,
that.
yeah. Okay. We'll just take your.
I got a short list here. So, I do. Briefly on the point of intersectionality. Intersectionality was developed out of Black womanist, Black women, Black queer ideology that said actually we should pay attention to the peculiar ways in which people are experiencing oppression or living out their identities. So I do not think the goal of intersectionality is to skip past the uniquenesses. I think actually that's the strength of it. And I believe, and it's not just my personal opinion, I think there's a body of work that suggests this. I believe that the weaknesses of any movements and the capacity to actually develop solidarity is with the glossing over the uniquenesses. I hear too often, particularly from white people on the left, how we need to not be paying attention to the unique expressions of the way that race may impact or gender may, and actually that's backwards. That's exactly what capitalism and how it manifests. We should be paying attention to it. So I think intersectionality is important. I think solidarity is important. I do not think we can achieve solidarity without looking at the unique ways in which people are impacted by capitalism or any form of oppression. I also do think that young people do have an analysis of capitalism. And in fact, there has been no social movement in this country where young people have not organized and young people have had class analysis with that organization. I think the defining feature of the Black Power movement as opposed to the Civil Rights movement was the critique of capitalism. That's what made Black Power, is that it was explicitly Black socialist, right? So I do think a lot of people have capitalist or class analysis, and I think that's expressed here. Myself,
included, but many of the folks who are on the streets are organizing. We're socialist by way of Black Panther Party study. You know what I mean? So I do think that that exists, and I mention that point because I think too often people misunderstand the work that's being done to a fault, and that impacts the way that we're able actually to do solidarity work. And I think that the other thing about the capitalist critique is people want to critique capitalism outside of racism and colonialism. And that's half the damn reason why we have this problem now. Because if we look at any environmental justice movement in this country that's worth being studied, it's the work of the indigenous and sovereign nations who've been saying this since day one. Since the Europeans have come here, but the reason why this movement hasn't caught up is because their environmental justice movement is also anti-colonial and anti-capital, and it says if you can't get with that, you can't get with this, right? And so I think this, for real, so I think this what happens, and this is part of the reason why I've only recently begun to identify as being part of the environmental justice movement, is this idea that environmental justice people or environmentalism is looking at these issues and nobody else is looking at them. But in fact, we're looking at them through every lens. We're thinking about race, gender, class, sexual, we're looking across the board. So really, I don't think the question here is how are we gonna get people to join us. We should be saying how we're gonna catch up to them. Because folks are doing the work and have been doing the work for a very long time. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, those are some fantastic comments. Do you want that?
Yeah, I think that when we talk about capitalism as a uniting force, there's a tendency to think of it as capitalism here and then all the individual movements here. Rather, the way I was looking at it is in a way that actually agrees with your point, which is that it's rather an undercurrent that connects these movements. And I think that the absence of exactly how those movements are connected through a common undercurrent, I think can undermine the unifying power of these movements. I think that they do have an individuality and a uniqueness that are very valuable, but I just think that a clarification or a common understanding as to how there's an undercurrent, that a basic sickness that causes different symptoms, I think is really important as a unifying force.
I think that there's like fundamental agreement. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Miriam. Between your points, but I think that the expression of it is really important. And so I work at the NAACP in climate justice, and I think definitely my understanding of intersectionality is closer to M's, but this question of whether or not there can be unity but still diversity and solidarity without requiring homogeneity is an important one. And I think that people want to talk about climate justice and are only willing to talk about climate justice if they're able to talk about it in a way that is impacting them, that it impacts their community.
Yep.
And I think that's important and necessary and should be retained in the environmental justice movement from the outset. Has always been a coalition of local movements. It's never been about building one big environmental justice movement, which I think is what you're saying is, correct me if I'm wrong, that what you're saying is seems to be the position of white environmental people on the left, like this idea that because we call it environmental justice movement, that it's somehow a homogenous movement, or that it should be a homogenous movement, that should be the goal. But I think that, I think there's fundamental agreement that there can be solidarity without homogeneity. And this question of like a unifying rallying cry, I think has been brought up. The idea that climate is a moral issue, but the reason that it's a moral issue for me is going to be different than the reason that it's a moral issue for a mom or for a Black person living in this community or a Latino person working in this community or under these working conditions. And that what we should be doing is building a platform on which all of us can stand together and raise our individual cry together collectively. Our voice will be stronger, but it won't be ever just one voice saying the same thing.
I did look at this, and it looks, Flood the System, I encourage people to look at it. It's got a lot of this in it. I want to just offer two kind of principles when we talk about guiding ideas. The idea of reclaiming the commons connected to reparations, that in terms of how we frame what this is about, this notion of the indigenous people's rights that to put that out as part of the vision of what we're claiming, I think is important, however this gets connected. And the second thing that, at least at UMass, is I mean, we haven't brought it into the politics yet, but the idea of a Green New Deal. People may have heard that term. It comes out of the UK New Economics Foundation, a weighty document you can download in 2008 that puts forward this vision that if you you can create, and it resonates very much with Van Jones's idea of a green collar economy and what Majority Carter is talking about, greening the ghetto. That essentially, if you tax corporations, a financial transaction tax like that on high velocity trading, you create enough revenue to make every building in the UK an energy creator, energy self-sufficient, and in the process create enough jobs to meet all the unemployment in the country. So this idea of a Green New Deal, that if we provide, with the idea of Commonwealth, if we provide people with co-op housing that people own, that's retrofit, that's zero energy, free transport, food self-sufficiency, those three things alone, right? Housing, transport, food self-sufficiency, then people don't need to work in the capitalist economy the same way. And as Van Jones was talking about, this idea for how do we give people control over their communities, that idea, so that's a kind of concrete plan. Now, how that connects with divestment, is the issue of how do we articulate this discussion on college campuses where we're connecting these things. I'm not really sure how that happens. The thing that I like to call on is that these institutions, academic institutions, are supposed to be the place where we're creating knowledge for the betterment of society. And instead, what we're doing is we're training people to go into occupations that continue the capitalist system, right? So either going into debt or working for IT, working for finance capital, working in engineering to reproduce the machine that's killing the planet, right? So how to build this larger, full scale, I think the totality that Marx talks about, the totalizing nature of capitalism, and how we bring this dialogue into the mix. I don't know, but I think, when you showed the map up there, right, and we add that to the anti-fracking movement around the country, we have a serious, and the Black Lives Matter movement, fast food forward. There's serious strands, going on here. So.
Yeah, and that's an important point. It's something that I was hopefully we can tease out a little bit more. How we can, I think that anti-fracking is, and linking that with divestment and linking that with Black Lives Matter really is critical and crucial to bringing about system change, which I think is what is really needed here, and how we can bring. Do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I saw that you have about 20 minutes left.
Okay.
In the session.
Yeah. Okay.
I think even beyond capitalism, you want to look at what created capitalism, and it's the patriarchy. And we all participate in this patriarchal system. Do we want to? We are participating. We are creating it. We are involved in it every day. And it's the thing that is holding capitalism there. And I think if we could tear down the patriarchy and not participate in it anymore, look at how we participate in it, then things like capitalism will go away, and all of these things that we don't like will go away because they're created by that. I also, when I read Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, I listed everything that she said, which was an action, and I came up with 110 different actions that she says are things that we could all do to change. So anybody wants the list,
I think that discussing just on a simple level the similarities without even talking about a broad movement or one whole solidarity movement, just the similarities between different fights and different issues is so important. Just because I once, as part of a women's rights club, we made all these posters about women's rights, and then we made some posters it was a social justice kind of week we were doing, and we made this one poster. Just somebody had an idea to do it. And it just had a blurb about environmental racism. And all these kids came up to me
and were like, I didn't know these things were like tied together, and all these kids were like, maybe I should join the environmental club, and all these kids were like, oh, I've never really thought about like women's rights or like racism and all these different things, and they were like, maybe I should open my eyes to that too. And I just thought it was so interesting, like how many people hadn't realized that these things are so interconnected while also being unique and valid movements on their own.
I think the divestment movement on college campuses actually has the potential to suck a lot, because it's very popular right now, it's very high profile, and it actually has decent funding. It has a potential to suck a lot of people into making connections with things beyond what they would have thought. It has a potential for being a gateway to connecting people who want to do change. I don't know if anyone has thoughts on specifically how to encourage that or enable that.
Yeah, actually, can we maybe try and brainstorm on that? How can we, just on a simple level, how can you make connections between your divestment or anti-fracking or Black Lives Matter or...
I was just asking this question on YouTube regarding to justice. Is there a world form for crime and justice? And
So,
a world form? Is there a world form? I'm new to the discipline. Is there a world form that then invites someone from each sector? I mean, I don't know if that. Then you pull someone from Black Lives Matter, you pull someone from all different sectors to start developing a conversation, to start developing means of funding, to start coordinating national, is there something like that already? Or?
Well, I know there's been tentative links, for instance, that, for those of you who follow the West Harvard's Facebook pages and tweets, they're constantly tweeting on Black Lives Matter issues. But these are just, I guess, tentative issues. Another school divested from prisons, and I can't remember which, does anyone know what school divested? That was just fossil fuels.
Was it Colombia?
Was it? Yeah, I think it was Colombia, and the fossil fuel divestment movement, they're connected with the private anti-privatization of prisons and benefiting from the prison industrial complex as well. So that was one link as well. So I think we're at a point where there is huge potential and there's tentative links between different movements, but it just needs to move that step further to kind of make these connections. You?
I guess in my work I've seen or been critical of this like kind of new call from the climate justice movement for intersectionality, and like that it sounds great and often and is really very needed, but there's concerns and like from groups that have been doing justice work for a long time, and like, oh, you need us now, but where were you when we've been having these issues being called up, and so I think there's a lot of if you're coming at this from a climate organizing side perspective, then there's a lot of I think internal work that you have to do before. I'm speaking personally as experience with working with white people in the climate movement, and like really doing that personal anti-racist work yourself before you're going to people and saying, I want us to work together on Black Lives Matter. It's like, have you done the internal unlearning first and like made a commitment to that? Because before, otherwise there's a level of like co-opting that happens, and of course it's good to see the intersections, but to do that at a deep level and a long-term commitment to it is what we need. We don't need more people to take on things for their power, for their potential to show unity, but not actually rebuilding those relationships.
There's also a risk of if you've got a larger, well-funded, usually white-dominated movement, like 350.org, basically coming in and expecting smaller, more local movements to be folded into what they're doing. A lot of the oxygen went out of local efforts to stop not just removal, for example.
Say what?
Became real large.
Stop.
I'm sorry?
I didn't hear everything you were saying.
This is speaking.
Okay, how far back do I go?
So I think she was saying that the 350.org took a lot of the energy out of more kind of,
Out of what was it?
out of more grassroots.
Mountaintop removal,
I see.
local efforts to do something about a problem specifically where they are. If you have a really large national organization, sort of the momentum of that is sort of an expectation that smaller movements that are, in addition to trying to address the larger problem, are trying to address its ramifications right by their home. The expectation is that they just sort of get folded into the larger movement and hope that everything comes out in the wash, when it really doesn't typically for people with relatively little power and money trying to solve a local manifestation of a larger problem.
And that brings back to your really good point earlier, is that the divestment movement needs to get grounded within local kind of more grassroots movements and have that sense of attachment, sense of place, sense of connection, and only then can I guess it can be attain some degree of longevity.
I'm thinking that I'm on base, but I'm gonna reintegrate again, and you can tell me why you think it's off base or something.
Okay.
But this Moral Monday movement, we started one in Indiana, there's one in North Carolina, I think there's a couple in the South, and it's under all the issues, climate change, environmental, LGBT rights, it's all of the issues that we are all being, oppressed, probably under oppression lens. So it's already organized. So what is the purpose of this thought process in lieu of an organization that sort of already exists that has like 80,000 people already?
I actually haven't heard of that.
It's called Moral Monday.
Yeah.
Reverend Barber is a really.
And they're organizing states.
Okay.
For a while, though,
Yeah. Well, I guess that all these different actions or activist groups, that come together, they're not necessarily competing, but I guess there is 350.org, I guess, has taken a kind of leadership role, or it's gotten really, really big at this point.
Is that who you're referencing? When you
No,
ask, how do we create a unified front? So then I'm thinking, well, there is sort of a unified front that's growing, so that's where
Yeah.
I'm getting a disconnect.
Yeah.
on
So
what-
then maybe, and that's I guess the question we're asking, like how can 350.org or how can other existing organizations all become linked together? And that's I guess the question we're posing rather than.
So I guess my recommendation, which hasn't been put on there, is contact Moral Monday, who has 80,000 plus people.
Okay.
And Indiana has started a broad coalition of all kinds of folks, NAACP, Sierra Club, all of the different union, trade. We're doing everybody in Indiana. He's got it in North Carolina. I don't know what other states. So there's already that vision.
350.org could be well linked to them. Mine just are not.
You're not listening. What are you talking about, 350? What she's saying, like, that's part of what I'm trying to say, was saying too, is that people keep saying, how can we create a unified front? What she's elevating is that some black people did, and it exists, and it's called Moral Mondays, and they work on a host of issues, and it's born out of this long legacy of like civil rights, civil disobedience, action organizing. It exists.
Okay.
If you want to be part of it, come on. But people are saying 350, and we like, no, because that don't represent us, right? Like that's not, they miss a whole lot of stuff. That's why we not unified, because I don't know what them people think about prisons. They might be like, build a jail for the sake of earth, whatever that means. But you know what I mean? So I think what she is saying is that that exists, right? And that's the challenge to this space, is like, how are people not seeing this? How are people not seeing, like, why aren't we saying, how do we support indigenous people? Why are we saying, why do we have to create this new thing that's far removed from what people are already doing?
I guess that
Divestment is under that lens. It's under the lens of Moral Monday.
Yeah.
Environmental climate justice, climate change, all of that is under this this lens. It's about speaking truth to power. It's about dramatic actions, taking coffins into the State House to represent 6,600 dead children, due to, the toxins in the air. I mean, he's all about civil disobedience, and there's a following, so.
Who's he?
It's
Reverend Barber.
It's Reverend, what's his?
William.
William Barber, out of North Carolina. If you Google his name, you'll see his videotapes, you'll see, all the people that are following him, and he says it's I can't think of that quote he says, but he says it's just wrong, it's just immoral what they're doing to us.
And what does Moral Monday mean? Why Monday?
They would show up at
They still show up every Monday at the State House. And so then any state that wants to organize under that lens, like we did in Indiana, and we had him come in Indiana, and we're doing teach-ins. I did an environmental workshop for us. Some other people did education. We're already organizing. So, I don't know if there's a bigger organized group, but I would recommend we consider tapping in and contacting something that's already morphing.
Yeah.
2 years ago, we went to Detroit under the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, and I had met some folks from North Carolina who were a part of that moral majority, and it is something that has been ongoing and is ongoing, and they are reaching out, trying to reach out to other organizations to come and join with them on that. I mean, just like the young lady said, it's already there. It's already happening.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? It's just a thing of who else is going to come in. Let's everybody else come in, and we can make this a united front throughout the country, because this is, we've had conference calls, you know what I'm saying, which we all have been on, which we all have been in. We have people from out in Arizona, Los Angeles. We even had a international table, people from Sri Lanka, from Brazil, you know what I'm saying, come and talk with us, you know what I'm saying, at this conference, you know what I'm saying, to let us know that this is not just happening here in the States. This is already a worldwide phenomenon. This is already a worldwide movement.
Yeah, and that's excellent, and that I think fantastic points here, and it raises the issue of the complexity of the environmental justice movement, and also some of the problems with it, understanding what environmental justice is, and that people have been working in environmental justice for decades, but it hasn't actually been defined within probably the wider Western understanding of what environmental justice actually
Ben
is.
has a comment.
Yeah.
Make your comment. It's about way more than decades. When you talk about indigenous people and what
Yeah.
they're doing,
Yeah.
a long time.
Centuries,
Okay,
yeah.
who you are and where you're working.
Yeah, and also that's one of the biggest criticisms of the upcoming agreement in Paris, that there is all this emphasis placed on will we get the agreement or not, or will it be another Copenhagen? And if anything, there needs to be some sort of people's treaty, or that we're not depending on nation states to essentially save the world from ourselves. That there needs to be some sort of people's treaty, and there needs to be recognition of all the indigenous peoples who are working on mountaintop removal or working coal extraction in other areas. That I think that leaving it to negotiators in Paris is quite worrying, but I do see hope, and even from this conversation, in terms of the passion from everyone here, in terms of the real diversity, in terms of backgrounds, in terms of issues that we all have, and I do see hope in terms of that there is this new critique in terms of capitalism, and even from my students, and Divestment has been good to give them a segue to this critique, and just as other movements are now as well. So I think we're kind of running out of time. I think the next session will potentially cover a lot of these issues, so I guess I'd encourage people to hang around for that. Maybe we can extend the the conversation. I'd like to thank Jessica. We had some other song and dance. Thanks for your participation. And I'd also acknowledge the difficulty of trying to address all the issues up here as well, and I hope I didn't sound like that offended. I wasn't offended. Okay, and thanks everyone.
Your Irish dance.
Oh yeah,
Sorry.
after the next session.